You know, there's something deeply satisfying about watching someone get their comeuppance, isn't there? That moment when the tables turn so completely that you almost can't believe what you're witnessing. Well, I'm about to share with you a story that will restore your faith in justice, even when it seems like the whole world is stacked against you. This is the kind of tale that proves sometimes the quietest person in the room is actually the most powerful, and that true strength doesn't always come dressed in designer clothes. If you're someone who believes that good people shouldn't finish last, if you've ever felt underestimated or looked down upon because of how you appear on the outside, then you absolutely need to hear what happened to me in that courtroom. I'm talking about the kind of plot twist that would make Hollywood screenwriters weep with envy. So go ahead and hit that like button right now, because I guarantee you, by the time I'm done telling you this story, you're going to want to share it with everyone you know. And while you're at it, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell, because I've got more incredible true stories like this one that will remind you why karma always finds a way. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of what's coming next. This isn't just a story about a court case. It's about dignity, justice, and the moment when someone who thought they held all the cards realized they were playing against someone who owned the entire deck. I still remember the way my hands trembled as I walked up those courthouse steps that gray October morning. I was wearing Robert's old cardigan, you know, the navy blue one, with the tiny hole near the left elbow that I could never bring myself to throw away. It still smelled faintly of his cologne, even after 3 years. My purse was this ancient leather thing I'd picked up at a thrift store, and my shoes were sensible flats that had seen better days. I looked exactly like what I was, a 68-year-old widow trying to stretch every dollar. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, fighting for what amounted to pocket change from the estate of a man I'd once shared everything with. All I wanted was a small settlement, enough to cover my late husband's medical bills that somehow became my responsibility after he passed. It seemed fair, considering I'd been married to Robert Morrison for 15 years before Victoria ever entered the picture. But the moment I stepped into that marble-floored courthouse, I knew I was outgunned. Victoria swept in like she owned the place, which, given her husband's wealth, she practically did. Designer heels clicked against the floor with the confidence of someone who'd never worried about money a day in her life. Her hair was salon perfect, her makeup flawless, and her black dress probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months. Behind her marched an army of lawyers in $1,000 suits, briefcases gleaming, ready for battle. My lawyer, bless his heart, was doing his best with what we had. Public defender Gary Chen was overworked and underpaid, juggling my case with dozens of others. He'd warned me that going up against Victoria's legal team was like bringing a butter knife to a gunfight. But I had to try. I owed it to Robert's memory, and more importantly, I owed it to myself. As we took our seats in that intimidating courtroom, I could feel eyes on me from every direction. The whispers started immediately, hushed comments about my appearance, my age, my obvious financial situation. Victoria's friends filled the gallery like it was some kind of social event, their jewelry catching the light as they leaned in to gossip. Even Judge Harrison seemed to size me up with barely concealed disdain, his eyes lingering on my worn cardigan with the kind of judgment that cut right through you. I should have known then that this wasn't going to be about justice. This was going to be about appearances, about who looked like they belonged in Robert Morrison's world. And I clearly didn't. The moment Victoria took the stand, I knew she was going for blood. She settled into that witness chair like it was a throne, her perfectly manicured hands folded, her voice dripping with fake sympathy as she began to paint me as nothing more than a desperate woman clinging to a past that never really belonged to me. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying that practiced sweetness that made my skin crawl. Robert often told me how guilty he felt about Margaret. She was from his college days, you understand, back when he was nobody special. He married her out of obligation, really. Young love. You know how it is. The way she said it made my 15-year marriage sound like a teenage mistake. Her lawyer nodded approvingly as Victoria continued her performance. Robert built his empire from nothing after we got together. He always said Margaret held him back, kept him small with her limited thinking. She never understood business, never contributed anything meaningful to his success. Frankly, it broke his heart to see how she refused to grow with him. Every word was a knife. But what made it worse was how the courtroom seemed to eat it up. I watched Judge Harrison, nodding along, completely captivated by her polished delivery. The gallery whispered their agreement. Of course, this elegant, sophisticated woman was telling the truth. Look at her, then look at me. Which one of us seemed like we belonged with a billionaire? When it came time for me to testify, my voice shook as I tried to defend the most precious 15 years of my life. I talked about the late nights when Robert would come home exhausted from building his business, how I'd make him dinner and listen to his dreams. I spoke about the sacrifices we both made, the tiny apartment we shared, how we saved every penny to invest in his vision. But even as I spoke, I could see it in their faces. They thought I was making it all up. Here was this pathetic old woman in a second-hand sweater, trying to convince them she'd once been married to Robert Morrison in his prime. The whispers grew louder, more cruel. Someone actually laughed when I mentioned how Robert used to call me his lucky charm. Victoria's friends exchanged knowing looks, their expressions a mixture of pity and disgust. Even my own lawyer looked uncomfortable, probably wishing he could disappear into the floor. The message was clear. I didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. The breaking point came when Victoria's lead attorney, a shark in an Armani suit, stood up with theatrical flair and demanded proof of my so-called contributions to Robert's success. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "Mrs. Morrison claims she was instrumental in building my client's late husband's empire. Where's the evidence? Where are the business documents? The incorporation papers? Surely someone who played such a vital role would have something to show for it." The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on me. This was it, the moment they expected me to crumble, to admit I was just a desperate widow, grasping at straws. Victoria leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smirk, probably already planning how she'd spend the money she thought she was about to save. But then something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the memory of Robert's voice, calling me his partner, his equal. Maybe it was the decades of quiet strength I'd built, carrying other people's underestimation. Or maybe I was just tired of being invisible. I reached into my old leather purse, the one they'd all been snickering about, and pulled out a manila folder. The edges were worn, the papers inside yellowed with age, but I'd kept them safe for over 20 years. My hands were steady now as I stood up, feeling taller than I had in years. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying a clarity that surprised even me, "I'd like to submit evidence of my contributions to Robert's empire." The lawyer's smirk faltered as I walked forward, my sensible flats making confident clicks on the marble floor. I placed the first document on the evidence table. It was the original incorporation papers for Morrison Enterprises, dated 1985. But here's what made the entire room go dead silent. There, in faded blue ink, were two signatures: Robert Morrison, founder and CEO, and right below it, Margaret Morrison, co-founder and equal partner. The judge leaned forward, his dismissive expression melting into shock. Victoria's lawyer grabbed the papers, his face going pale as he read. But I wasn't done. I pulled out deed after deed, contract after contract, all bearing both our names. The land Robert built his first factory on, my family's property, the initial investment that launched the company, my inheritance from my grandmother. "You see," I said quietly, "I didn't just support Robert's dreams, I funded them." Retry. The silence in that courtroom was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop as Judge Harrison studied document after document, his face growing redder with each page. Victoria's army of expensive lawyers were frantically whispering among themselves, shuffling through papers like they might find some magical loophole that could undo 30 years of legal history. But there was no escaping the truth that was now spread across that evidence table like a roadmap of my life. Every contract, every deed, every business agreement told the same story. Margaret Morrison wasn't just Robert's first wife. She was his original partner, his co-founder, the woman who'd literally made his empire possible. Victoria's perfect composure finally cracked. The color drained from her face as she stared at those documents like they were written in a foreign language. Her lawyer leaned over to whisper something urgent in her ear, but she just shook her head in stunned disbelief. This wasn't how her story was supposed to end. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the dismissive tone he'd used with me earlier. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, and for the first time all day, he was addressing me with respect. "These documents indicate that you retained significant legal rights to the Morrison estate, rights that appear to have been overlooked in the current proceedings." Overlooked, that was one way to put it. The truth was, when Robert and I divorced, I could have fought for half of everything. Instead, I'd signed away my claims for a settlement that I'd quietly donated to charity, keeping only one thing: lifetime rights to our original property, the land where Robert built his first success, the same land that was now worth more than $50 million. Victoria's lawyer made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, arguing about statute of limitations and changed circumstances. But it was over, and everyone in that room knew it. The judge awarded me not just what I'd originally asked for, but recognition of my continuing legal rights to the estate. As Victoria stormed out of the courtroom, her designer heels clicking furiously against the marble, she turned back once to look at me. The hatred in her eyes was almost palpable. But there was something else there too. The dawning realization that she'd spent years living off the foundation that another woman had built. Justice, it turned out, had been waiting patiently in an old leather purse all along. You know what struck me most as I walked down those courthouse steps that day? It wasn't the victory, though I won't lie. There was something deeply satisfying about watching Victoria's world crumble around her designer shoes. It wasn't even the money, because honestly, that was never what this was really about. What hit me was how quiet everything felt after all that noise, all that drama, all those years of people assuming they knew my story just by looking at me. The truth is, I didn't keep that money. Just like 30 years ago, when I walked away from half of everything Robert and I had built together, I donated most of my settlement to legal aid organizations. Places that help people like the woman I appeared to be that morning. People who can't afford armies of lawyers and perfect court outfits. Because I learned something important in that courtroom. Your worth isn't determined by the price tag on your clothes or the balance in your bank account. But here's what I want you to remember from my story. And this is important. Never ever let anyone make you feel small because of how you look or where you come from. Margaret Morrison in her thrift store cardigan was the same person who co-founded a billion-dollar empire. The only thing that changed was other people's perception, and that says everything about them and nothing about me. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone underestimates, then please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's someone who's been judged unfairly, or someone who's fighting their own battle against people who think they don't belong. We all need reminders that dignity and truth have a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deep someone tries to bury them. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. Real stories about real people who prove that karma doesn't always arrive on schedule, but it always arrives exactly when it's supposed to. Sometimes it comes dressed in designer clothes, and sometimes it comes carrying an old leather purse full of yellowed documents. Either way, it's always worth the wait. Until next time, remember, never judge a book by its cover. You never know what chapters you might be missing.